Okay, I'm going to do a whole bunch of the World War I packet. Before I get going though, I want to tell you the assignments coming up for next week. Chapter 22 in Henrietta outline, let's make that due on Monday. And then Zen chapter 14, let's make that due on Tuesday. And for those of you who don't have a book, I'll make copies and you can pick it up tomorrow. It's pages, or you'll read it, it's like 11 pages, chapter 14 is, and do questions 3, 7, 8, 11, and 12. 3, 7, 8, 11, and 12. Zen chapter 14 due on Tuesday, and Henrietta chapter 22 due on Monday. The Zen is fast, and I would do that quick, and it goes quick, and the questions are pretty good. So I'll have copies for people if you want to start doing that after I get done. So I'll probably have 2 or 3 videos to watch on YouTube, and then when I get done with that, you can work on Zen or work on Henrietta or work on something else. And on Monday, when I get back, I will finish the World War I packet and probably get done on Monday with it. And then we'll have a long time looking at a lot of primary evidence from World War I, the posters, the songs, the weird stuff that goes on. And that will take almost a day. So we'll be done with all of World War I and the imperialism on Tuesday. Your test will be on Friday, and Wednesday and Thursday will probably start in the 1920s. But that's how we'll do it, and so we'll be done with that, and then we'll have 2 or 3 more units until we're all finished. And I think you guys will like the 20s and 30s units, really fun. And then we'll do a small World War II unit, and then the big Papa Smurf unit. So there's that. And Chad can actually have you guys do this. I want you to take a second. You can stop this video if you want, and just take a second with somebody around you, and I want you to consider where America was at before the war, and then let's talk about early American neutrality and why America is beginning to break that neutrality. All right, why was America neutral? Why was America not neutral? Who was neutral? Who didn't like England? Take about 90 seconds and talk about that real quickly, and then you can get this video going. And like I said, it'll be probably 2 or 3 videos. I'm going to be moving fast. I'll be moving fast. Hopefully not talking so fast. I'll be speaking no German words. Although you all know how to speak German. Even Rahel knows how to speak German now, so that is good. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, if Dustin's here or if Tess is here, if you can teach them how to speak German and catch them up, that'd be great. So here we go. We talked about the Zimmerman note. Oh, sorry, we talked about the Lusitania, and I'll bring my World War I map here. We talked about the Lusitania being, that's World War II, never mind. Don't look at this. Look elsewhere. Okay, now you can look. We talked about Lusitania being sunk by the Germans. We talked about the Arabic being sunk. We talked about the Sussex being sunk. We talked about the Sussex Ultimatum, where Americans, specifically Wilson, is giving the Kaiser an ultimatum saying if you don't stop sinking vessels with American lives on it, then we're going to cut off diplomatic relations. The Germans said okay, but you have to stop the blockade in the north. And so we're in this period of watchful waiting when Wilson gets elected, and then bad things begin to happen. In January of 1917, and this is vitally important, in January of 1917, Germany decides to ignore the Sussex Ultimatum and begins waging what we call unrestricted submarine warfare. They made the argument that since the British continued to blockade them, then they weren't breaking anything. In fact, America didn't live up to its end of the bargain. So the Germans started unrestricted submarine warfare, and this was a calculated risk. The reason the Germans were doing this was, remember, they were fighting at this point a two-front war, although soon Russia would drop out, that if they started sinking everything they possibly could, it would help them with victory. And if America came into the war, that's really bad for the Germans, but what they calculated was, and on some level they were right, the Americans would take forever to get there. And their hope was that by allowing themselves the ability to sink whatever they want with U-boats, and it was very effective, that by the time America got there, the war would be over. Now that didn't happen, but it did take America a long time to actually mobilize for war. So the unrestricted submarine warfare starts in January, and Wilson wanted to start arming American ships, not obviously naval ships, but merchant ships. Put guns on merchant ships, allow them to protect themselves. But we had members of Congress who said no. We had members of Congress who were called isolationists. They did not want to involve themselves in this conflict, and they said no. But then Wilson was able to get a hold of the Zimmerman Note. And as most of you probably know, this was a letter between the German Foreign Secretary to Mexico that was eventually released in March of 1917 that said, told Mexico, if you will help us fight America, then if the Allies lose, let's say the Central Powers win, then Mexico, you can get part of your land back that you lost in the Mexican War. Remember the Mexican War, the United States got New Mexico, bought California, got Arizona. They finally officially got Texas, although I think, and Austin can agree, that we can give that freaking state back to wherever it came from. But that being said, when the Zimmerman Note was released to the press, this begins America's call for war. People start demanding war, and they see that between unrestricted submarine warfare and Zimmerman Note, that's a big deal, especially since after unrestricted submarine warfare occurred, and after the Zimmerman Note was published, Germany started sinking more and more ships, and Americans were dying. And then by April, Wilson called for war, and it wasn't unanimous. 50 people in the House actually voted against war, and 6 in the Senate voted against war. Although it was an overwhelming majority called for war, gave Wilson the declaration of war, the United States is at war. And there are essentially 5 reasons why we went to war. The most important reason by far, and this is often on the AP exam, was in the end the declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany sinking whatever it wanted to was the most powerful reason for American entrance. Obviously the Zimmerman Note was part of it. A third reason was Russia, the Russian Civil War began, and the Russian Revolution began, and they began fighting in 1917, and it looked like that was going to be also a destabilizing factor. A fourth reason, the United States thought if they could end the war quickly, that the United States would have a major role in deciding what the rest of the world would look like. So if they had a major role in deciding what the rest of the world would look like, it would be to America's benefit to go ahead and get in the war so America could have a say. If they did not get involved in the war, then Europe and much of the rest of the world would have a fate decided with no American influence, and Wilson thought that with Americans' influence on the rise, that we should have a say in this. I'll also remind you back with the Zimmerman Note that we were already having problems with Mexico, so it wasn't like they were asking Mexico out of nowhere. And then the fifth reason was the moral reason. America believed that it had a moral responsibility, that it was the moral nation. That these European nations were sort of sullied by war, and America was this moral nation. We were going to be going up against the evil Germans who had killed, tons and tons of citizens in Belgium during the Schlieffen Plan, and were seen to be brutal, and all this propaganda showed them as being horrible. And so these are our big reasons for war. But Wilson had to convince people that we needed to go to war. And Wilson used high-mindedness to convince the rest of the world. Wilson's high-mindedness, Wilson's reasons for war, or Wilson's idealism, essentially had two main parts to it. And the two main parts are both really great and condescending all at the same time. Number one, that America is going to get in this war. We're going to get in this war because we want to make the world safe for democracy. That when America enters a war, it's because we're there to make the world safe for democracy. You know, these European countries, they want, land, and they want imperial, holdings or colonial holdings. They don't like each other. It's nationalism, right? Not America. We're there to make the world safe for democracy. And lastly, America is going to enter this war to end all war. This war, and the word for World War I was the Great War, the term, because obviously they didn't call it World War I, they weren't anticipating a second World War. This Great War, Wilson wanted it to be the war to end all wars. That if we get involved, we're going to finish this in such a way that wars will no longer be necessary. We're beyond that. And one of the ways that he went about doing this was announcing the creation of his 14 points. He announced the creation of his 14 points in January of 1918. And his 14 points were essentially targeted for not only the countries fighting for the Allied side, but even for those Central Powers fighting, to give them reason to stop. That maybe Wilson's redesign for the world, the 14 points were Wilson's view of what the world should look like, would entice the Central and Allied powers to stop fighting, because what the world would look like with Wilson's 14 points would be fantastic. And I'll give you a few of them, obviously not all of them. Many of them are trying to fix reasons that we got into war. So for example, one of them is the abolition of all secret treaties. So Wilson wanted to end those secret alliances that were so fiendishly important in bringing this war to a beginning. Number two, he wanted to advocate for freedom of the seas. Specifically, Germany did not feel like they had freedom of the seas because of the blockade. And Britain, obviously, with the U-boats. He wanted to remove economic barriers. That is to say, begin to do away with tariffs and barriers that are put up between countries economically, because he argued, and probably rightfully so, that the more economic barriers are between countries, the more likely those countries are to have military engagements. That is, if the countries are more interconnected or interdependent economically, they would be much less likely to go to war. And free trade advocates have long argued this, and it's hard to argue against, actually. Fourthly, there needs to be a reduction of arms. We need to just have less weapons. This is going to be great for taxpayers because they don't have to pay for all these weapons. But it's also going to be likely to induce diplomacy rather than military options, because countries won't have all these weapons to use. So diplomacy will be necessary to begin with. Fewer colonial claims. Allow native people to have access to their own governments. Instead of European countries colonizing, perhaps they can self-govern. Which leads us to another point. I promise I'm not going to give all 14. I think I give 7. So I give half. It's the 7 points. Also, I don't know all 14. The promise of self-determination. There are groups, in fact, if you look up at this map, whose countries just sort of went away for a while. You can see there is no Poland. There is no Czechoslovakia. These countries went away when the map was redrawn. One with the Franco-Prussian War, even before that with the Congress of Vienna. And these countries, Poland, which is there is no Polish country, but Polish people are there, right? And so are Czechs. And so they'll get their countries back. And lastly, what Wilson wanted the most, his 14th point, in fact what he's going to give up a lot to get, is the establishment of a worldwide organization focused on collective security, or focused on peace, and it's the League of Nations, which ironically America created but did not involve itself in, and was not overwhelmingly effective, although it's going to be the precursor to the United Nations. So that is leading up to the war, and we'll do mobilizing for war next.